Welcome back, Eleanor McMahon, to the 905 podcast. Great to have you back again, and this time with more of your bike hat on. Last time it was the Trans-Canada Trail, and now to talk about the Ontario Bike Summit, and which happened this week in Hamilton, which is an annual get together, and perhaps we'll just kick off by describing what the Ontario Bike Summit is and what goes on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me. Love the podcast, by the way, and so delighted to be a guest. So you're catching me at a really interesting time. Speaking of the Bike Summit, I'm actually leaving today for Europe to attend the global cycling conference Velocity, which is hosted by the European Cyclist Federation and brings countries and experts and enthusiasts from around the world. So I am speaking in my capacity as the CEO of the Trans-Canada Trail, but this will probably be the 6th or 7th Velocity that I attend, and it's an opportunity to convene important conversations and see colleagues who are like-minded and learn from them. And I think that's really the genesis of the Ontario Bike Summit is exactly the same, although on a much smaller scale. As you know, I started the Share the Road Cycling Coalition in 2007 after I lost my husband in a sudden and horrific sort of crash. He was killed by a careless driver who was later convicted just north of our home here in Burlington. He was on a training ride, and his loss really catalyzed our efforts to do exactly what the Velocity conference does, which is convene experts, bring people together, share best practices. Because when I started Share the Road, and I started traveling around the world, not just Velocity, but even in the United States, and I saw what they were doing there, how they had a really strong movement of political support and public policy frameworks and laws, all of which supported cycling, very little of which we had here in Ontario. It inspired me to do the same. And so for 15 years now, we've brought together municipal leaders, planners, engineers, advocates, public health, law enforcement, all of the usual suspects who are in this cauldron of active, healthy, safe communities and wanting to transform communities. And as you point out, not just transform communities through infrastructure change, but also hearts and minds. Because, and I know we'll talk about this today, but cycling in this country and in Ontario as well is still far too polarized. And I would argue, and we did some polling that we shared at the summit that demonstrates this, that more and more people want safe places to ride, regardless of whether you're a cyclist or a motorist. They want politicians, they want decision makers to make different and better decisions that are in the interest of safety for all. And there are still some naysayers who are fighting that transformative change, despite the fact that a growing number of people, an astounding number of people in Ontario actually want them. So if it brings comfort to everyone to know that more and more people want to ride their bike more and more often for all of the obvious benefits, and shouldn't we all be trying to do that? I mean, it just, to me, makes absolute sense. So the Bike Summit was really that event every year. And it's become a forum for best practices in the municipal sector. There really isn't another one in Ontario like it. And it's one of the few in North America that really brings this level of decision maker together. So it's working, and it's helping us to lead the change that we want to see.
Now, I mean, I was lucky enough to attend one of the sessions on Sunday, and it was by the Dutch Cycling Embassy, which is actually a government-funded embassy, if you like, to sort of spread the word about cycling around the world. Really interesting, and and you have to forgive me for not remembering the names of the speakers, but the two gentlemen who were speaking were just the level of infrastructure in the Netherlands, obviously, for cycling. I mean, people know about that, and but it is still extraordinary when you see it, and how there are national standards for safety, how the design of everything is done in a way to minimize the amount of signage that's actually required, that you can see from the design of the road what you're supposed to do. And that's for both drivers and for cyclists and pedestrians, so they know how to interact, so that there's a standard. it really is quite something. And then I guess the um uh, setting in a Canadian perspective, you're like, they're so far ahead of us. How are we ever going to catch up? And then to an extent, there's that thing of the minute that someone tries to do a new cycling piece of infrastructure. And I remember certainly in Burlington, there's been a couple of examples over the years of a fairly minor sort of project creating huge kind of a kickback. Um, how do you think we do overcome these kind of too familiar processes?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the Dutch cycling embassy, I guess 3 points. The cycling embassy is, as you described it perfectly, Roland, it is an ambassadorial opportunity for the country, the Netherlands, who, like the Danes have a cycling embassy too. And what those countries decided is that they have the magic sauce, if you will. They have created a society where they found a way for cyclists and motorists to coexist. And by the way, both of those countries are robust economies. They didn't fall off the edge of the earth because suddenly they decided that they should, these are G7 countries that are doing extremely well economically. So if they found a way for cars and cyclists to coexist, I mean, really, I'm fond of saying, we put men on the moon and brought them back again. Surely to goodness, we're smart people, and these folks have done it. And they've successfully done it. And they've saved lives in the process. They've helped their economies. They've made people fitter. They've kept their cities safer and more convivial and more intimate. And when all of us think of Europe, what do we think? We think of cafes in the square, and we think about people moving at a slower pace. I mean, why can't we have those things where we live? If people define that as a really nice quality of life, why should we have to go across the Atlantic and experience it on holiday for a couple of weeks? Why can't we live like that too? And increasingly, cities around the world, cities in North America, are doing it, and with tremendous benefits. A good example is New York City. Perfect example. Republican mayor, for heaven's sakes, Bloomberg, for all kinds of reasons, including the changing climate, but efficiency and traffic. He actually said, we're going to close Times Square to cars. And people said, oh my goodness, you what? And he did it. And he led the change. He and Jeanette Sadik-Khan, who was his commissioner of transportation, someone I know personally and have gotten to call a friend over the years, they transformed Times Square. And if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere, as the song says. And not only was traffic enhanced and improved, but the businesses in Times Square, their profits skyrocketed because people actually were walking at human scale, going into shops, spending money at restaurants, leisurely cafe moments. All of these happen when you remove cars from the equation and you give people the chance to economically take their time, spend money, and that's what's happening. But instead, we have these unfortunate sort of attitudes here on this side of the Atlantic that if you take cars away even a little bit, and no one is saying, my goodness, we have to live without cars. I use my car, and I'm like most of Ontarians. In fact, our recent polling shows this. 77% of people who cycle regularly, of which I'm one, also drive regularly. So people are cyclists and motorists at the same time. It's not one versus the other. That argument, it seems to me, is a false narrative that is utilized by people who really don't know what to do, and so they do nothing. And instead they point fingers and polarize. And that's not what we need here. We need courageous leadership to give people what they tell us they want, which is those healthy, safe, active communities that prioritize the most vulnerable among us, our pedestrians and our cyclists, and give them space. Because after all, Roland, the bike that is beside you in its own safe place in a lane, and hopefully a physically separated lane, is the car that isn't in front of you. So you want to talk about lessening congestion and making it safer and more convenient for all of us to take our cars when we need to, get the bikes out of the way, put them beside us, they stay safe, and that we all are safer in that particular instance. The Dutch have done it. We brought them here to Hamilton. As it happens, the Dutch Cycling Embassy I was there when it was launched about 12 years ago. It's extraordinary that the people who lead it, Lucas Harms is the director who was with us in Hamilton, bring that sensibility of innovation and the ability to do what the Dutch have done, which is transform their cities. And by the way, as they pointed out in their presentations, they were like us not so long ago. 30, 35 years ago, Dutch cities were dominated by cars and congestion and people that wanted to ride. Those people were getting hurt and injured and even killed, unfortunately. And they made the decision to transform their cities in the interest of safety and, making it more efficient and low cost. Final point, we're living in times now with high inflation and the economy is a little bit uncertain. And so finding ways for people to get around that are increasingly efficient and cost effective, lighten their load, lighten their wallet. Why not? Cycling is the answer for all of that. And I want us to be more like the Dutch.
Why is it that we're seeing such resistance to this change, especially, coming out of the COVID pandemic? Number of people who adamantly were just saying, no, I'm not doing the commute. I'm not getting in my car and driving into Toronto or driving an hour into my office to go to work. I'd rather work closer to home, take when I go for a coffee break, I can go for a walk around the block, or I can take a bike ride to my downtown to go work or grab a bite to eat or grab a coffee or whatever have you. Like, clearly the people have responded positively to that lifestyle change for the 2 years or so. And I'm wondering why are we just like, why is that now people are like saying, hey, I like that, I like to keep that. Let's see how we can make that that part of the pandemic a permanent fixture. And now we're stuck with this kind of resistance to that change. And is it just like human nature that we're just scared of, oh, it's changed, therefore now we must be scared of it because I don't know what might happen, or is there something more to that resistance?
I think that a lot of it is based on perception and not reality. I think that there's a little bit of education that we still need to do. We're fed a steady diet of how hard this is. We're fed a steady diet of fear because we lose so many people. Unfortunately, I was on the coroner's review into cycling deaths, which I called, by the way, between 2006 and 12, we lost 125 souls who chose to ride their bicycle for all kinds of good reasons. And I think that, quite rightly so, there's an element of fear that's associated with people's decision to take the bicycle. If we had more people riding bikes more often, we would be in a situation where we would have more infrastructure for them, because the number one reason people don't ride, according to our surveys, 48% of them say, I'm too frightened to ride. What's the number one thing that's going to get them on their bikes more often and faster? Investments in infrastructure. There's a pent-up demand. More people want to ride. More than half of them said so. Regular cyclists, it's over 70%. They say, I would ride more often if I had more infrastructure and more places to go. So I don't know how much more clear evidence we need that there is, a demand for action here, that there's this pent-up demand. And as you pointed out, during the pandemic, places like Toronto added 40 kilometers of bike lanes and did active TO because people's mental and physical well-being meant that they wanted to get outside and do things that are good for their mental health, be it on a trail or on a bike path, and getting out and having the freedom of riding your bicycle and the ability to choose. So there was never a better time than now to think about how we can get people, how we can meet those needs, how we can make their dreams come true. If they want to ride more often, then let's find ways to get them on a bike more often, to the benefit of our congestion, to the benefit of our economy, to their health and well-being. And let's lower our healthcare costs too, because that's another thing that everyone is preoccupied by, the rising costs of things. Our healthcare system is stressed at the moment, but the Dutch have found a way to save $9 billion a year in healthcare costs. And the way in which they do it is cycling. They've invested in infrastructure. It's sort of like when the oil crisis hit, they took a right turn and we took a left turn. They built, invested in transit in cycling and making it easy, safe, and convenient for people to ride. And we built smaller cars. So there's a choice to be made. And we're on our way. I mean, cities like Hamilton are making really good progress. It's why we brought this bike summit there, because we wanted to shine a light on all of the positivity that's happening in Hamilton. Good political will, really good staff, and things are happening. So let's catalyze it.
Could you maybe expand on that a bit? Because that's a phrase we don't hear too often, is good things are happening in Hamilton.
Yes.
And Hamilton as an example of other cities in the 905. Can you maybe just expand on like what drew your attention to Hamilton and the what's happening there?
Great question. So in 2010, the Share the Road Cycling Coalition did bring the Bicycle Friendly Communities program to Canada. I first saw the Bike Friendly program in 2007 when I attended a summit by the League of American Bicyclists, which is a Washington-based organization like the coalition, but on a broader scale. It's national in scope. They have quite a significant group of staff that lobby Congress. They have a robust cycling caucus in Congress, and they've achieved a great deal. And so when I encountered them, I thought, wow, I want to bring a lot of this to Canada, to Ontario in particular. I've seen what they did. I saw the political champions they have, and I wanted that. And so this program, to me, was a perfect way to recognize progress in a really positive way, to encourage continued progress by rewarding constant progress, and also giving a really good fact-based report back to city staff and politicians to say, okay, Hamilton, you're doing really well on these 5 things, but these 5 things over here are missing or need work, and you need improvement. So we awarded Hamilton a Silver Bicycle Friendly Community Award. The last time we looked at their application and reviewed it was 2.5 years ago. Since then, they've continued to make progress, and I would wager to say that they're on their way to gold. There are 3 gold cities in Ontario: Ottawa, Toronto, and Waterloo, meaning that they've done innovative things. They've invested in infrastructure. There's a holistic approach to getting people cycling more often. They have safety and education and awareness campaigns that positively encourage people to ride. And they're prioritizing infrastructure investments that do that, because, by the way, cycling infrastructure is the most cost-effective infrastructure above all. We still need to build roads occasionally, but when you add cycling infrastructure, you've just enhanced the economic activity on that road, and you're going to save lives. So, and it's cheap. So why not do it more often? It's a no-brainer.
It's actually, I'm going to use myself as an example again, as having moved to Hamilton in the last 18 months, and became basically a cyclist primarily as my main means of transport most of the time, using the Sobe, the street bikes which are really cheap. It's a great system. They're everywhere. You can pick them up anywhere, drop them off everywhere, and it really is a really good system. And it's also just, when I lived in Burlington, I could count the number of times I cycled on the fingers of one hand, probably. I always meant to cycle more, and then I didn't, because it just wasn't ever quite appealing enough. Burlington's a good place I felt, and you can correct me or contradict me, but I felt it was a good place to cycle for recreation, for exercise, because there was like the paths which were going to the parks and places like that. It was less of a good place to cycle if you wanted to go to the shops and go and buy stuff. Yeah, Hamilton has done some really good things. I mean, I can get pretty much anywhere in town, avoiding the worst streets, if you like. And there are some streets, I mean, I'm going to name names, and I live near Dundurn, and Dundurn has a cycle path on it, but I don't want to go near it because it's a horrible road. And the surface needs to be replaced, and it doesn't feel safe. And then you go on some of the other streets, Herkimer, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yes, Herkimer,
I don't know how to pronounce the names yet. Where they've put the cycle path protected basically by the parked cars. So you're completely separated from the traffic, and that's fantastic. And it just changes your entire view of going down that road. It's a quieter road anyway. It's less busy, obviously, than Dundurn. But yeah, you literally see how it changes your view of getting on a bike and going somewhere. So yeah, it's unexpectedly, I've sort of found myself in this in a more of a cycling mindset of late, and it's like, yeah, this is good. I feel it's exercise. I feel good after I've done it. And Hamilton's definitely done some good things, and they definitely need to look at some of their road surfaces.
They do.
I'm talking about Aberdeen and Dundurn in particular.
Yes, they do. I've cycled on Aberdeen. I know exactly what you mean. But you raise a good point. It's the little things. Joel kind of touched on this earlier, and I may just sort of revisit the question, because I would add the following, that there's a psychology. So in some places in Ontario, and this is not unique to Ontario by any means, you'll see politicians say, oh, we built a bike lane over there and nobody's ever on it. Well, if you've got a bike lane that goes 2 or 3 blocks and it's not connected to any other infrastructure, meaning you have to take your life in your hands to get there. And once you're on it, okay, great, I'm good for a couple of blocks. And then you have to white knuckle it by turning onto another road that has no infrastructure. That is not safe cycling infrastructure. That is not creating a network that's pleasant. Would you put your child on that? No. We should be creating cities, and many cities around the world have done this already, that are safe for people from 8 to 80. Meaning, when I've been to the Netherlands, there are people in their 80s riding their bikes, and they've ridden their bikes their whole lives. They've had the option. And when you have the option, most people choose it, especially in places like Canada, which, believe it or not, 40% of our trips in Canada are under 10 kilometers. So when you think about that, and you think about your daily trips, I live in Burlington, as you know, Roland, and I try as much as I can to take my bike. I'm incented to take it where there's infrastructure. Where there isn't infrastructure, I'm not interested, because I don't feel safe. Would I take my bike more often to the shops and so on? Absolutely, I would, 100%. I would take my bicycle more often if I felt safe to do it, but I don't. And so again, it's a chicken and egg thing. I've heard politicians say, well, we built a bike lane there. Yeah, but that doesn't count. If you have a bike lane in the middle of nowhere, you may see that very few people use it, because they have to take their life in their hands to get there. And once they leave it, they're taking their lives in their hands again. So what is it about that doesn't make us feel empathy towards those people who are our neighbors, our friends, our family, and we should be looking after each other, and we're not.
What strikes me about the whole cycling debate, which puzzles me in some cases, is like here in Burlington, I live in Burlington as well. There was I found an interesting map put out by the city of Burlington on all the bike paths and bike routes that were available in the city. And the idea was like, oh, look at you can go along major thoroughfares on your bike, and you can connect up into this and go and park. And I was like, oh my God, it's fantastic. And there are 2 things that popped in my head after I saw this map. One was how poorly marked in the city these routes are. And like, I was just, they were trying to advertise, look at all the work that all we've done. I said, why is it that as I'm going through the city on a casual outing, I don't know, these are like invisible bike paths, which I think is a major problem to begin with. And 2 was how disconnected they were. Because I said, okay, if I wanted to get from one end of the city using my bike, how could I do that? And I realized I couldn't. I cannot get on one path and say, okay, I'm going to bike from literally the southwest corner of the city all the way to the new development in the northeast using one path or like a route. And it dawned on me, I said, why this disconnect? Like, it's almost like it's like a tokenism, right? It's like, we built you a bike path, now shut up and go away. And I've always wondered, in a city of Burlington, Hamilton, Mississauga, or even Toronto size, is that you can put a bike path pretty much anywhere if you think about it. And I thought, what? And a bike takes up so much little space as compared to the volume that a car of any size would take up. And I said, that's a recipe for success. If you just say it doesn't, a bike path does not, or a bike route does not have to go on a major thoroughfare. Like you do not have to put bikes on major roadways. And that's the debate that I always hear is,
you shouldn't.
we built, we want to build we want to put a bike path on a major road, right? In Toronto, so it's, they're going to turn Yonge Street and shrink it down by putting bike paths.
No, that was a good idea, by the way.
Okay, but my point was being is that it's not necessarily that case. Like the idea is that you have people who are in the subdivisions beside Yonge Street or beside the major roads. How do you get them to avoid using the road as much as possible? Because you can put those bike paths or designated bike routes in the subdivisions, hook them up to parks, and then build biking pathways, throughout the city that are healthier. They don't require as much maintenance. And I can imagine the cost in terms of the city budget is relatively cheap.
Oh yeah, they're very cheap. It's the cheapest kind of infrastructure.
And so I'm again, I kind of come back to this. Why are we so hesitant to do this? Like, why do we not have politicians at the provincial and municipal levels to just say, you know what, pardon my French, but fuck it, I'm just going to build it's a dirt path, a gravel path cutting through the city so that somebody could bike from one end to the other. Like, why is this so hard for politicians to do? It's almost like a willful effort to not do it, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I'm going to push back ever so gently, Joel. I see where you're going, and I'll get there in a moment, but I do think I think it's a better city is one that is safe for everybody. And when you start thinking about bike lanes as an invasion of space rather than an accommodation tool, cyclists are not a special interest group. They are 68% of Ontarians who ride regularly, according to our polling. That's 9 million people who are riding their bike on a regular basis. 22% of people, or over 3 million people, ride it daily. So that we're beyond a special interest group or a few folks who want to get in the saddle occasionally. These are people who are actively choosing, for all kinds of good reasons, that they want to get on their bikes more often. And a lot of them don't have any other choice. They don't have another mode of transportation. It's $10,000 a year to own a car. If you are in a privileged snack bracket, you can afford to own one, insure it, gas it up on a regular basis. But if you're a student or a knowledge worker or someone who's starting your job and you're trying to pay your rent and a rising inflation, you can't afford to have a car. So those are very real people who every day are riding anyway on substandard infrastructure, and they're losing their lives. So, places like Yonge Street or places in Burlington like New Street that connect people to shops, to school, to businesses, to City Hall, to the downtown, those are viable routes because they convey people. People spend money once they're on them. They shop at the businesses that they pass by and park. There's reams of study from around the world, including from Toronto and other places, that show that cyclists spend more money than motorists who are speeding through a city and not stopping. And that's part of what you're seeing in Hamilton. They're going to turn the King Street and Main, and to convert them from 6-lane highways that existed post-war to take the folks who worked at the steel factories to the steel factories from their homes in the downtown. We're not doing that anymore. We don't live that way anymore. And the city of Hamilton has won 2 national awards for their complete street design for precisely that reason. They are converting that city from a post-industrial city that took workers from A to B to now a city where the workforce is different, where people are living differently and working differently and staying home more often, and technology has made it so. So, that transformation, though, that recognition by the Institute for Transportation Engineers, to name one, is a perfect example of why Hamilton is a city that's courageously decided, nope, we're going to make it possible for people to ride their bikes more often. We're going to make it possible to ride their bikes to the LRT and connect them to transit, like they do in the Netherlands, by the way, in a seamless way, and make it easy and safe for people. Why, to your point about the sort of the dialogue that happens politically and otherwise, we're changing the conversation. and this is something I'm proud of that Share the Road has done over the years. It has changed the conversation at a political level and made it easier for politicians who want to make change, who want to be courageous and lead this transformation. I long for the day where it's not courageous to be an advocate for cycling infrastructure, where it's just normal, where you yourself are a cyclist, because many of them are, and it's normal. And that's what the Dutch have now. They, in a funny way, they don't go to parties, Joel, and they have conversations with their friends and say, oh, I'm a cyclist. They don't refer to themselves in that way. They don't define themselves by their mode of transportation. It's just the way they get around. I'm a person who lives in Burlington who occasionally takes their bicycle and also drives. They don't define themselves by, a particular mode of transportation. So we're getting away from that. I'm impatient. I want to see it happen faster.
I thought the parallel, actually, one of the speakers from the Dutch cycling embassy was from Rotterdam. And for anybody that is not particularly familiar with the Netherlands, Rotterdam is kind of a bit like Hamilton. It's like a big industrial city, and probably a little bit post-industrial too. I know it's a port city, but it's there's quite a lot of parallels there. And it was a city where characterized post Second World War, where there was a lot of destruction. They replaced that destruction with wide highways designed to get cars fast through the city, and they turned that around. So this idea that the Netherlands always has a cycling culture, or that these old cities with narrow streets and quaint whatever are more designed for that anyway. Those are the kinds of things I suspect people would tend to throw up as reasons why you can't do it in a place like Hamilton. And it's like, you can. They've done it in Rotterdam. And what you end up with is not just a more cycling friendly city, but look at the photographs. You've got this ugly, horrible car jammed street, in Rotterdam in the 1980s, or in Hamilton right now, if we're talking about King and Main, and transforming those into just much more beautiful streets, more attractive streets, whereas King and Main really are like barriers in the middle of Hamilton. It seemed to me, since I've moved here, and they're also the barriers across the center of the city that as a pedestrian or as a cyclist you want to steer clear of. But for people coming from outside the city, they're the only thing people ever see, because if you come to Hamilton, you can drive down King or Main, and it's like, well, why would you come to Hamilton? It's
bad first
off
impression
on not much of a question, but very much a kind of point. But the end result of all this is more beautiful cities, isn't it?
I don't. There's something you mentioned, Roland, like it kind of clicked in my head as you were talking. You're talking about how here in North America we always get told, oh, European cities they're narrow streets because they were built for the horse and buggy, the era of medieval Europe, right? And that's how we in North America envision it. But we forgot World War II destroyed a lot of that. Well, like the Second World War destroyed it, and when they rebuilt it to kind of be like this modern, Americanized layout, including the Netherlands. And so they're trying to reverse that decision since in the post-war era. And it dawned on me, we in Ontario are facing that current situation. Like we are actually in that predicament, because the other topic we religiously talk about on this podcast is housing and development. And the Ontario government has made a claim they need to build 1.5 million homes within 10 years. That's a lot of homes. That's a lot of infrastructure. That's a lot of new housing development. There's a lot of new people. And with that comes all the consequences of new roads, new infrastructure and whatnot. And it's dawned on me, like, that's kind of the opposite problem what Europe had. Post World War II, they had to rebuild, and they rebuilt in an Americanized suburban idea. We have an opportunity now to kind of reverse that suburban idea and say, well, no, we can build maybe a bit more European, a bit more utilitarian, a little bit more pedestrian. And in this phrase, pedestrian is a positive word. And I don't know, I'm putting the idea out there, but I just see like we're at a kind of a crossroads where we can build in two different directions: continue sprawl or something a little bit more innovative and a little bit more unique to redesign our cities in a way that is a bit more people centric as opposed to car centric.
For sure. Yeah, well, cities are for people and not just for cars. That's an important point. Cities are for people. The public square is about people. Increasingly, public squares around Europe have closed their inner cities to cars altogether. There are large cities, Brussels being one, that has converted its downtown and its places around its parliament and taken away all the vehicles. Part of that's security, but that's a good thing. But they've changed it back into the public realm, because in Canada, you're absolutely right. Post-Second World War and the industrial sort of boom that it created resulted in, again, places like Hamilton building 6-lane highways basically through the city. That doesn't help economic development. That doesn't make you want to get out of your car and go shopping or visit or do a slow roll through the city and stop at a cafe and meander. You just want to get in your car and go as fast as you possibly can. That doesn't incent you to stop and it create a livable atmosphere that's attractive to people. I think your point's well taken that, European cities have built on a much smaller footprint than we have. They could have done, the kind of sprawl that we have, but they chose not to do it. They made different choices. They invested in transit and cycling and those kinds of efficient modes of transportation, rather than the dynamic where in a number of North American cities, people who have smaller income differentials can't afford to live in the downtown anymore. We've become overpriced in the downtown. And those are the very same people that don't have access to the kind of transportation via a car that other people do. So what are our downtowns increasingly look like? Wealthy, far too many cars, not enough transportation options, people who have lower income streams forced into a very narrow set of transportation options, whereas if we invested in more cycling options, they could ride a bike, good for them, good for the environment, and good for the city. And so expanding your transportation options comes with building a city that's more livable, even though it's more dense. So you're absolutely right. They have a large footprint. Those of us who've had the privilege of going to Europe know that these cities are concentrated in a hectares, an environment that is much more enclosed, surrounded by beautiful countryside. Could they have built into the countryside? Yes, but they chose not to. They went up because they didn't want to build the unbikeable, unlikable landscape. They didn't want to lessen people's transportation options and force them to have to take a car everywhere, and also put them in a situation where those lands need to be serviced. So yes, we're building more homes, but we have to think about schools and services and sewage and running pipes to get people's houses up and running and electricity grids, all of which add to our energy woes. Whereas if we built in a more densified environment, and the current government is making decisions about changing the way we build our cities that are going to have lasting impacts, I would argue, in not necessarily a positive way.
I think we should probably leave it there. I know we've kept you longer than we should have done. you have to get a plane to catch, and
yes,
you've been very generous with your time. So thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And we could talk about this again. I think it's something we want to return to again in the future. But in the meantime, go and catch that plane.
Thank you. And thank you, Joel and Roland, for a very thoughtful conversation. You're both so engaging on this topic, and don't hesitate to invite me back. You're right. There's lots to explore. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.